Okay, let's start. Let's start with a video so people can join the session.
Solids, liquids, and gases. The stuff of planet Earth.
T-minus 20 seconds and counting.
Pretty ordinary, most of it.
15, 14, 13, 12.
But put ordinary things together, and extraordinary things can happen. Synchronization. 1,000 parts and processes unified. Small achievements choreographed into massive breakthroughs. Oh, everybody talks about it, but those who do it, and do it well, there's nothing quite like it. So here's to the parts and pieces and the fine-tuned processes. To the synchronization that makes beautiful things work and things work beautifully. We need it now more than ever. In a world of complex security threats, it's time for coordination. In a time of confusing options, it's time for organization. From the leader in IT security, it's time.
Okay, so synchronized security, that will be the topic today. How many here in the audience knows anything about Sophos? 1, 2, 3, some people. Okay, so you who know about Sophos probably are familiar with one product that we're actually having in our portfolio. So maybe you're familiar with our Endpoint Protection, or maybe our firewalls, or our wireless solutions. But we actually have a lot of different security solutions in our portfolio. So basically everything from then, if you look on the left-hand side, you see the network protection products that we have. So the UTM, the next generation firewall, the web email appliance, and then of course also wireless solutions. On the right-hand side, you see the endpoint protection, the next generation endpoint, the mobile server protection, and also encryption solutions. So I will basically, my presentation today will focus on the next generation firewall that we have, our next generation endpoint, and our file encryption solution, and basically show you a little bit on how these different security solutions can actually work together to offer the end customer a better security. So that's the basics. Another really important part for us is, of course, also the analytics part. So you can trace to see exactly what happened during an attack. So you can go back and see, okay, for example, one user got an email with a malware, and he said that he hasn't clicked on anything, right? That's what users normally would say. But with the analytics part, you can actually track this back and see, okay, this user got an email, he opened that Word document, and it contained a macro that actually infected that computer. And also, of course, centralized management is another very important part for us, so that you have basically a centralized management for all of these different products, and I'll come into that a bit more when I do my presentation here. So just to give you a short overview for you who don't know anything about Sophos, haven't heard of us before. So Sophos is a UK-based company, so a European company. We have 4 labs across the world. I hope you like my animation there of the different labs. I made that myself. I'm very proud of that. And one thing that is unique with Sophos Labs is that a lot of security vendors, they're basically focused on one side of security. So they're either focused on the network security side or they're focused on the endpoint security side. But our labs, since we do have these different products, we also need to equip our labs with the capability of detecting threats from different vectors. So everything from network threats to endpoint threats, and all of that is collected by the Sophos labs. And then, of course, distributed to all of our customers. So just to step back a little bit, talk about the evolution of antivirus, because Sophos started in 1985. And then everything was basically signature-based detection. These were the good old days where basically you got a malware, we took a fingerprint of that malware, and then put it in our signature file. And then we sent that signature file out to all of our customers. Back in '85, we actually sent a floppy disk to all the customers once a month approximately, to basically protect their computers. It was that easy back then. But then over the years, security threats has basically changed, so we also need to adapt our detection methods accordingly. So we've added a lot of security on the endpoints as well, so everything from anti-spam, client firewall, behavior analysis is one of those things. When I started working with IT security 10, 15 years ago, this was one of those things that I really got excited about, behavior analysis, where basically we're looking at what is this process doing in our system? How is it behaving? For example, if it's a keylogger, is it logging everything that's being written and so on? So we can basically shrink down the signature file and just look at the behavior of programs and then create definitions for that instead of looking at the actual fingerprint of each individual file. So that was exciting times. Then, of course, we saw more and more threats coming from the web, so we added that. Live protection, which basically is a real-time protection. And another really exciting time for me was also when we introduced the malicious traffic detection, the MTD engine on the endpoints. So malicious traffic detection basically monitors if your endpoint is trying to establish a connection to a command and control server. This is normally something that has been around for quite some time, but it has mostly been on the firewall side. We have done this type of analysis on the firewall side. However, we actually took that technology and put it on the endpoint. And there are a lot of benefits of doing it on the endpoint level instead of doing it on the firewall. So one benefit is that, first of all, if we're doing it on the firewall, if the computer is not behind the firewall, since there's a lot of laptops and things like that, then they aren't protected against these types of threats. Another really big benefit is also that if we do it on the firewall level, we can only see which IP address in our network is trying to establish a connection to a command and control server. If we're doing it on the endpoint level instead, we can actually identify which process is actually trying to establish a connection and then simply kill that process that's trying to establish a connection to command and control server. So much more efficient doing it on the endpoint level. And then the latest functionality that we've added to our endpoint protection is signatureless. So I'll talk more about that with our new Intercept X product that we've also launched. But like I said, there are a lot of different threats. This is just a summary of how many threats we collect every day, so 350,000 malware samples. This is a figure that you probably heard from a lot of different vendors. Varies maybe a little bit between different vendors, but this is basically the number of malware samples that we collect. And this would traditionally be detected with signatures. Most of them are also, of course, targeted to Windows, but there are threats to other platforms as well. We see more and more threats coming out to Mac. So everyone that has a Mac computer and think that they don't need to have an AV installed, we actually do see more and more malwares coming out to that platform as well. And currently, one of the biggest growing platforms that we see most threats coming out for is actually for Android devices. So more and more threats, so 15,000 malware samples is collected every day by Sophos. And this is something that has just exploded over the last couple of years. When I started working for Sophos, it was maybe 50 to 100 malware samples that we collected every year. But now it has basically blown up, and now we see approximately 15,000. But if we look at the malware family, so just because we do detect a lot of these signatures or basically malware samples doesn't mean that every malware sample that we detect is from a unique family. So we see that most of the malware is coming from approximately between 500 and 2,000 malware families. And this is where the behavior analysis is really efficient on detecting. So we can instead see, okay, this family creates this type of infection on your endpoint, and then we can collect that behavior and create a definition for that, and basically protect that endpoint against that malware family. But lately there's been more and more exploit techniques being used to infect your endpoints. And today it's approximately 24 different exploit techniques are currently being used. And this is where the signature-less detection comes into play, where we don't care about the malware family, we don't care about the signature or definition of the malware. We're just looking at the exploit techniques that these malwares tend to use and protect you against any of these exploit techniques being used on your endpoint. And I'll come back to that as well a little bit later when I talk about the Intercept X. So this is just a graph showing you how many vulnerabilities are being detected approximately each year. So it varies a little bit from, well, something between 4,000 vulnerabilities to 8,000 vulnerabilities per year. The interesting thing is, though, that if we look at a vulnerability in an application or in the operating system or a web browser, is that it takes some time before the organization actually patches their infrastructure to be able to not basically have that vulnerability in their system. So just a normal rate would be that if, let's say Microsoft, for example, detect a vulnerability in one of their applications, it would take them approximately 3 months to patch that vulnerability. And then it would take, on average, about 7 months before all the endpoints in an organization is also patched against that vulnerability, meaning that we have a 9-month gap for a vulnerability to actually be exploitable, so that a malware can actually exploit that vulnerability and try to infect your endpoint. So this is something, of course, one question that I get quite often is, okay, so we see a big variant on different numbers here. So like in 2014, there were a lot more vulnerabilities than in 2015. And this, of course, also has to do with all vendors are always trying to make their software as secure as possible. They're handing out money basically to black hat organizations or white hat organizations to basically find these vulnerabilities before they actually launch the product. So that's something that has become much, much better over the last couple of years. But the interesting thing here is that even though we discover these number of vulnerabilities, the same 24 exploit techniques are still being used against all of these different vulnerabilities. So I'll show you some examples of exploit techniques that are being used in the wild a bit later. But just to paint a picture basically, so I thought I would just start a little bit with the current threat landscape, so to speak. So just talk a little bit about Cryptolocker, because of course Cryptolocker is a big problem for many organizations today. So I'll not go into too much detail on this. I know that a lot of seminars are probably talking about this, so I'll just run this through. But there are different versions out there, and it's becoming more and more popular for organizations to get in, or more and more frequent for organizations to get infected with these types of ransomware. So when I started working with IT security, this was one of the first malwares that I actually came into contact with, the love letter. Does anyone remember that one? This was still today my favorite malware. I think it was so genius because it used a level of social engineering, which I kind of like, to basically fool the users into clicking on a file that's attached to an email. And this was, still today, is one of the fastest spreading malwares, if you count different versions. But this is still one of the most fastest spreading malwares, the love letter. However, it didn't do that much harm. It basically, when you double-clicked on this file, it just looked through your contacts and then forward this email to everyone in your contacts. So that was the capability of this malware. But interesting to see, anyways, how users didn't really care. They got a love letter for someone they know, and they basically saw and just double-clicked on that. But Cryptolocker is definitely a lot worse. So there are, well, if we look back on the history of Cryptolocker, the first recorded Cryptolocker was in 2013. Basically, Cryptolocker today is more or less dead. But a lot of other vendors, basically what happened was in 2014, the law enforcement basically took down the creators of Cryptolocker. And then what he did before he got arrested was he basically created a template, or basically released the source code so that other people can actually continue on creating new versions of Cryptolocker. And this has really exploded. And the reason is, of course, there's a lot of money behind it. So if you look at the last sentence here, according to the US Department of Justice, Cryptolocker earned $27 million for its owner in just 2 months. So this is basically what's driving the infections of crypto ransomware. So has anyone seen this screen? This was one of the first versions of Cryptolocker. I like this one. This is actually not Cryptolocker. This is actually Locky. But you can see there on the top that it still states that it's Cryptolocker. So I guess that this is some sort of brand recognition so that the user know what they get infected with, because everyone knows about Cryptolocker, but no one probably knows about Locky. What's Locky? So the principle are still the same. You basically get infected, it will start to encrypt your files on your endpoint. They probably also have some sort of user interface team that basically updates their user interface to make it look better. So this is a newer version of the crypto ransomware. And they also changed some parts of the ransomware. So, well, when the first version was released, they actually used an AES 256-bit encryption algorithm to encrypt your files. They've actually changed that to a 128-bit encryption algorithm. So I get the question every now and then, okay, so if they're using a weaker encryption algorithm, is it possible then to decrypt the files? Well, no. That's the basic answer. If you have access to a supercomputer, a really fast computer, and you just use a brute force attack against an AES 128-bit encryption, it will still take you billions of years. So you're out of luck there, unfortunately. They also target different files, so basically they try to target, of course, files that has any value for the end user, so everything from Word documents to Excel documents, pictures, movies, and so on and so on. And this has also changed a little bit in the newer versions that we're seeing that's coming out. We actually saw one new ransomware called the Petya ransomware, where basically they, instead of using file encryption, they actually did a full disk encryption, encrypting your whole disk. So when you rebooted your computer, you basically you got the BIOS screen saying you need to go to this website and pay this amount of money to be able to access your computer again. One of the most popular ransomwares today is still the CryptoWall. Just wanted to have this in here, just so you get an idea a little bit on how it's spreading across the world. So we actually saw that most of the ransomware came from Australia and Asia from the beginning, and then has basically spread throughout the world. So, but we still see that if we count Europe altogether, which is approximately 30%, and then the US, which only has 7% infection rate, this is. Well, there are different reasons for this, of course. One reason is that in Europe and in the US, we do have better security. So, and we are maybe more cautious against this. But we also see data indicating that we haven't been hit as hard as the other regions. So our guess is definitely that we haven't seen the worst yet when it comes to this type of ransomwares. So there are different methods of spreading the ransomware. One of the first methods that they used was the simple, if we go back to the love letter days again, they sent out an email with a file that had a double extension to fool the user to double click on that file. But since media coverage has been much higher on this, people are got more aware, so they've basically stopped clicking on this. So they've started with new methods. So everything from emails with a link to active content in Word and PDFs, and of course drive-by downloads is something that we're seeing a lot more lately as well. And I think that when we start to see drive-by downloads becoming more and more frequent, that is also when we'll see that this starts to spread really quickly across the world. So just some examples, how it can look like. You get an email. I like this one. This is from the tax department in Sweden, basically saying that if you want to have your tax money back, you need to click on this link. The reason why I like this one is because it also had some Russian letters in it. Kind of sets you off there, yeah. I like this one as well. This is a ransomware within a macro. And basically, they actually provide you with a manual saying, okay, so if you want to enable macro, if your company has actually deactivated the use of macro, this is how you can actually bypass those settings. So they're very kind in that way, providing you with a manual how to bypass the corporate security settings. I like this one as well, where it just states that, okay, this document is encrypted, you need to enable macro. Very simple, still fools a lot of people. So there's also, basically when you get infected with ransomware, it will follow the sequence of events. So first of all, it'll start with installation, and then it will basically contact its headquarters. And this is once again why the malicious traffic detection is so important to have on your endpoint. We'll download the key and start the encryption phase, and then you get prompted with the extortion phase. So if I do pay my money, if I do pay the bad guys the money, will I get my files back? Well, yeah, you will in most cases, because this is basically their business idea. So if people start to pay money and they don't get anything back, people will stop paying the money. So they need to be able to provide something, otherwise people will stop paying. So yes, you will in most cases actually get your files back. Really quickly also on exploit kits, because this is, like I said, drive-by downloads is definitely something that we're seeing more and more. So Angler is one of the most popular exploit kits today. And what's interesting with Angler is that it's becoming so big that it's actually targeting approximately 90,000 victims per day. Out of those 90,000, only approximately 9,000 are served with an exploit technique. And out of those people, 40%, so 3,600 computers are actually being compromised. And 62% of the malware that Angler is delivering to the endpoints is ransomware, because that's where they see the quick money, basically. So, yeah, just, I know I'm probably running out of time a little bit, so I'll rush through this. So I'll talk more about the Intercept X product. So Intercept X is a new complement to our endpoint protection. So you can run this alongside a competitive antivirus that you currently have. So, for example, if you're running McAfee, you can actually have the Intercept X product running alongside. We do cover 3 different aspects with Intercept X. So advanced malware, limited visibility, and zero-day exploits. So with the advanced malware, we do cover the anti-ransomware. So we have a feature in Intercept X called CryptoGuard, which basically will discover if there's any encryption going on your endpoint. What we can then do is also restore the files that actually got encrypted if you have the product installed. We also have the root cause analysis that can basically give you a better picture of what happened during an infection, where did this actually come from, so you can visualize the whole infection phase. And then also the anti-exploit part. And with the anti-exploit, we do cover the 24 known exploit techniques. So everything from like heap spray, where you try to target unused memory on the endpoint that, for example, a process has allocated, try to basically execute your code through another process. And I also think that this is very important, that when we're talking about anti-exploit, so a lot of vendors will go out and say, okay, we do have anti-exploit in our product, but I think it's very important to actually know, okay, so what type of anti-exploit techniques are you actually implementing in your product compared to the competition? On the encryption phase, since we're talking about the synchronized security, so this is where basically the different security solutions starts to interact with each other. So we also have encryption, and on the full disk encryption, we can encrypt files on the endpoint automatically without the users ever knowing that. And we don't demand any ransom for getting the encryption key to open your files, of course. But it's a very good way to securing all the files, all the data on that endpoint. And what we're doing is we're checking 3 different things here on the endpoint. So first of all, we're checking that the user is the correct user trying to open a file. We're also making sure that the application that's trying to open an encrypted document is a correct application. So it's, if you, for example, have a PowerPoint presentation, that it's actually PowerPoint that's trying to open this file, not a malware that's trying to steal the data. And also that the endpoint is secure. So what will happen is if your endpoint, for example, becomes compromised, we can actually remove the encryption keys from the endpoint, working together with the endpoint protection to secure all the data until that threat is basically neutralized on that endpoint. On the firewall side, we also interact with this whole heartbeat, the synchronized security. So the endpoint and the firewall can actually communicate and share information between each other. So if we do detect something on an endpoint, we can tell that to the firewall. The firewall can investigate if we can see that on any other endpoints in the system, and maybe temporarily also shut this computer down from network access so it can't access any other computers or spread through the network. We can also do application visibility with the heartbeat. So if we can't determine which application is trying to establish a connection through the firewall from the endpoint to the cloud, we can actually, with the heartbeat, request that information from the endpoint to see which process is actually trying to establish this communication, and then also take decisive action if this application should be allowed to access the cloud or not. And then we can also do this the reversed way. So, for example, if you're publishing a web server or something like that, a VPN, we can actually also check that the endpoint is secure before we can actually allow that person to come into our network. So there's a lot of benefit of using this synchronized security to get these different security solutions to interact with each other. Oh, sorry. Just mute this one. Okay, 1 second, some technical problems here. Let's first of all mute this one. So just wanted to show you really quickly. So this is an endpoint that we have that has both the encryption product installed on the endpoint and the endpoint protection. And currently this endpoint protection has a green status, meaning that everything is okay, your endpoint is up to date, you don't have any active malwares on your endpoint. We can also go through and see some events that has occurred on this endpoint, and also some settings. We can allow the end users to, for example, override the settings if they need to troubleshoot or something like that on the endpoint, so this is also possible. However, this of course can also be prevented so that the users can't do this if you don't want them to. If we look at the safeguard, the file encryption, you can see that we have a key ring. So these are the keys that we're basically using to encrypt all the files. So you can see some documents there as well. They have the green lock indicating that these 2 files are now encrypted. If we switch back to the server side, you can also see the encryption solution. And you can see that we have the remove keys on compromised machines, meaning that if a device, for example, becomes infected with malware, what we'll then do is we'll basically secure the information, the data on that endpoint until that threat is neutralized. We also have some other features here, so like an Outlook plugin. So if a user sends an encrypted document to another person, we can actually then say, how would you like to send this? Would you like to password protect this file, or would you like to send this file in plain text? This is the Sophos Central dashboard. And if we look into the threat protection, you can see some of the features in the Intercept X. So here you also have the possibility to tweak the protection, so everything from the threat analysis, where we can actually collect the information about what's occurring during an attack, the CryptoGuard, the protection files for ransomware attacks, and also the anti-exploit techniques for different applications like web browsers, Java plugins, Office documents, Office applications, and so on. So if we go back to the endpoint again, just to demonstrate how the users would normally work. So we have here a file with a macro in it that actually is launching our test tool, the Sophos tester, just to illustrate what will happen during an attack. So if we launch that one, we'll see that it will launch the Sophos tester. And the Sophos tester is a tool that you can basically simulate an attack through another application. So we can then select, okay, which application do we want to run this attack through? So just select, for example, dummy application, and then select which type of attack do we want to run, ransomware, and then, for example, HydroCrypt. We're doing this in a control state, so we're just launching this attack against this particular folder that you see in the background there with the test files. And then if we go into the execute part, we can basically run the HydroCrypt ransomware against this folder alone. So you see now that when we clicked on execute, it will start to encrypt. And we actually allowed it to encrypt a few files, the test 00, 01, and 02. But then we started to see that there's some ransomware activity going on the endpoint. And what we then do is we restore the original files back to normal and also block the process that's trying to do this on the endpoint. So everything is basically secured. And now we also have a red status on our endpoint. So now we can decide, okay, what should happen if you have a red status? Well, one example is that we then go into the key ring again, and you can see that the keys are now removed from the endpoint because the endpoint is no longer secured. And then if I try to open a document, well, I can't open that document anymore because I don't have the encryption key anymore. But when the computer goes back to a green status, of course, then we'll put the keys back on the endpoint so that the user has access to all the files. Am I running out of time? Yes, okay. Really, just skip through here. I just want to show you one last part. This is very powerful as well, where you can basically track on what's happened on the endpoint. You can see which business files has been attacked. You can also see which processes and if there's been any network connections. And we also have the visualize part where you can actually visualize the whole attack, the sequence of attack, to see, okay, where did this come from? It came from a macro in a Word document, and maybe try to establish some network connections, and so on and so on. I think I'm done.